Welcome to Subject to Interpretation, the podcast where today we explore the critical role of language access, language justice, and interpretation in due process and civil rights. I'm your host, Maria Ceballos-Wallis, and today we are honored to have a special guest, Rachel Rossi, former director of the Office for Access to Justice at the U.S. Department of Justice. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks so much for having me, Maria. It's a delight to be here.
Well, before we get on to the matter of the podcast, I want to give our listeners and our viewers a little bit more information about you. You have been a champion of access to justice and leading groundbreaking initiatives to remove barriers for communities that face legal inequities for many years. Today, we're going to talk about your work at the DOJ and the importance of language access in the justice system, and also what's next for you. So, Rachel, tell us about yourself. I know that you've got a very interesting and varied background. Let's start with that.
Thanks so much, Maria. Yes, I most recently served as the director of the Office for Access to Justice, and in that role was privileged to do a lot of the work to lead on language access across the Justice Department. But before that, I actually started my career as a public defender, both in the county courts and in the federal courts in Los Angeles, where language access was also critical day to day in the work that we did. After being a public defender for almost a decade, I went to work on the Hill. So I worked on the Senate side and on the House side for a couple of years, where I worked on federal legislation and really enjoyed getting that experience as well.
So you were at the Department of Justice, the Access to Justice office for close to 2 years?
Yep, that's right.
Tell us more about that.
So I started at the Office for Access to Justice in June of 2022. And there were many different missions that the office is focused on with this sort of broad mandate to ensure that all communities have access to all of our legal systems. So criminal legal systems, civil legal systems, immigration systems. How do we make sure that we're breaking down barriers so that all communities have access? Naturally fitting in that mission was language access. And so we ended up for the first time ever, there was a new position created, the department-wide language access coordinator, and that position sat in the Office for Access to Justice and did a lot of work to lead on developing resources and streamlining access to language resources across the department, chairing the DOJ Language Access Working Group, creating the DOJ Language Access Plan, and promoting uniformity of policies across the department when it comes to language access, and essentially sort of leading when it comes to language access policy across the Justice Department. So one of the more exciting efforts that we were excited to get to do at the Office for Access to Justice was to build out that work and to build out that team. And one of the big, I would say, accomplishments was in 2023, we were able to update the Department of Justice Language Access Plan for the first time in over a decade.
So what was the purpose of a language access plan, and how was updating it important?
So the department, like many federal agencies, had a language access plan for many years. And the purpose of the plan was to take us deeper beyond just, we comply with federal requirements to ensure language access. The language access plan, its goal was to say, how do we do that as the Department of Justice? And so the plan covers a number of different areas, but it centers on what offices across DOJ are required to do and what the department as a whole is required to do. The updates that we made were pretty exciting. So we did things to make the approach on policies to language access modernized. We modernized language. We, for the first time, incorporated an understanding of the intersectionality with deaf and hard of hearing communities and language access, which is often sometimes siloed and not quite incorporated into the conversation. The updated language access plan also had a more robust area with guidance on proactive outreach and engagement with communities that are LEP, in order to promote not just, translating and sort of making our materials accessible, but actually proactively engaging with and connecting to communities who do not predominantly speak English. The updated plan did things like it clarified the processes for agents for individuals to alert an agency, to alert the Department of Justice if they needed language access resources or if certain language access needs weren't being met. It included more guidance on training for staff so that we were regularly training federal employees at the Justice Department on language access. And it also had some certain requirements, procedural requirements, like that every 5 years we would have to revise and update the plan to make sure that it is up to date and current. And it required all the DOJ offices across the Justice Department to create their own individual language access plan as well, because there's so many different offices across DOJ and they have very different mandates. So their language access plans might look a little different.
What would be the main components of a language access plan in the different offices?
So similar to the major DOJ language access plan, the main DOJ language access plan directed DOJ offices to sort of mirror the categories of what was in the main DOJ language access plan. And so, there's a section on policy, there's a section on training, there's a section on digital access to digital and online information. There's a section on all of the different responsibilities and roles of different parties at the Justice Department. What does the language access coordinator do? What does the language access working group do? Kind of clarified all of that. So yeah.
Now, I imagine when you updated the language access plan, there was a lot of knowledge that was gained through having gone, through COVID, the COVID-19 pandemic, and all of the digital, all of the electronic changes that we had to go through.
That is exactly right. And I would say the second piece was, and to me, across any work that I have ever done, one of the most critical and important things to do is engage with community and engage with organizations that work with community and represent community members. So a big piece of developing the plan was making sure we were engaging with groups that represent and work and fight for communities that do not predominantly speak English as well.
Now, you also spearheaded a translation initiative, right?
That's right. Yes. And we were very excited about the translation initiative that we launched. So essentially, we, as this sort of new project of the language access team at the Access to Justice Office, we wanted to figure out how can we tangibly support our colleagues across the Justice Department to make things more accessible across languages. So we put our money where our mouth was, and we offered free for any DOJ office that needed support in translating forms, online content, any materials that they use for community engagement, just sort of anything that they wanted to have translated. We would provide technical assistance for them, and then we would foot the bill and get it translated for them. And the technical assistance, we were surprised to see was actually quite important, because a lot of times we'd have, DOJ is massive, and we have offices all across the country. And oftentimes we would have an office reach out to us and say, we'd love to translate this particular website. Let's do it in Spanish. And we would sit down with them and say, well, okay, the top 5 languages in your district are the following. What if we translate into those top 5 languages? Or, you're looking at materials related to hate crimes and you have a very high AA and HPI community in your district? What if we look to translate some of these materials into these languages because of an increase in hate crimes against AA and NHPI community members? So kind of helping them look through what is the content, who are you trying to reach, and how do we make sure that when we translate, we're thinking about those communities, if that makes sense.
So before we go on, AANHPI is Asian American North Pacific. Oh my goodness, I messed it up. I'm so sorry. I knew it. Asian American and
Native Hawaiian.
Native Hawaiian.
Yes.
Pacific Islander. There you go. I put the H in the wrong place. So the reason I'm highlighting this, apart from spelling out the acronym, is also that there is often this misconception that Spanish is the only language that we cater to in the United States. And there really is a vast number of languages and a vast number of communities. And it all varies geographically, right? You said the top five. The top five are not always the ones you think that they're going to be in any given place.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the pieces of the DOJ language access plan that I think was so important. We actually included in the plan for DOJ offices, these are the places you can look to figure out what are the top languages spoken in my district or in my community. Because for a lot of folks, just like you said, there isn't really an understanding of the languages spoken in the district or in the particular area geographically.
Now, we tend to focus here on subject to interpretation a lot on, interpretation. And because a lot of our listeners and viewers are interpreters, whether they be in educational settings or medical settings or legal settings, we really kind of, focus on those things. But, language access and access to justice as they intersect, it is very clear to me that there is a space that's outside of these processes where interpreters are used that needs to be served. And that was one of the examples you gave us about the anti-hate campaigns. Tell us a little bit more about that so that we can get a sense of it, outside of our own, little silo, as you said earlier.
Right. I think that's a really good way of putting it, because a lot of times when we think about language access, we may think about a courtroom and we may think about, particular trial or a case or, and a lot of the services and the resources that the Justice Department provides to ensure justice to communities at large, it actually happens outside of a courtroom. So things like the United Against Hate campaign, which U.S. attorney offices across the country all participated in, which required a lot of the development of materials to just educate community members on what hate crimes are, how to report hate crimes. And so finding ways to make sure that those materials are translated and accessible to the community are critical. Making sure that our websites, the forms on our websites, that those are translated and accessible are critical. So, the Department of Justice provides grant funding, does investigation, does law enforcement, that has a number of policy offices that put out policies and guidance, and all of that may not occur in a courtroom, or a lot of that may not occur in a case, but we want to make sure that the public has access in the same way as any person who speaks English.
Why is this important to you? How did you come to get involved, not just in, I guess, public service, but how did, access to justice and, I guess, language access become, one of your projects?
Well, I am the daughter of immigrants who my mom's first language was Greek and my dad's first language was Spanish. So my mom was born in Greece, my dad was born in the Dominican Republic. And I grew up speaking English. But very, very early on, it was so clear and so evident how language is so critical to identity and so critical to communication and to access. I saw that from a very early age, and now am also actively trying to learn both Spanish and Greek. But seeing that sort of, I think, provided the lens by which I have looked through my entire career. But then when I was a public defender, I also saw it in the courtrooms, and I saw how if someone came into a courtroom speaking English, and if someone came into a courtroom not speaking English, I saw how different outcomes could occur. I saw how people could be treated differently. I saw how, sometimes people who came into a courtroom and didn't speak Spanish, where there were interpreters available, they may have to sit in jail for some days until an interpreter is available for their language. So I saw how justice, just in the clients that I worked with, I saw how justice can be impacted if the language services and resources aren't there.
Did you have to learn to work with interpreters, or did you have to, or was it intuitive for you being the daughter of immigrants of varied nationalities?
I would say I had to learn, but as a young LA County public defender, you didn't always have the time to be taught how to do things appropriately. There also would be moments where I would say, I would just have to say a couple of things directly to a client in my broken Spanish because the interpreters were all unavailable, right? But no, I think in the process of kind of being in the courtrooms and being with the same interpreters all the time, you sort of learn from the interpreters and you sort of see how, first of all, how overworked they are and how they're being called to different cases and different people. And you also get a sense for how to make sure that you're sort of working with them in the appropriate way where you're not speaking too quickly, where you're understanding that they're understanding and that they're understanding that your client is understanding as well. And I think that is a process and it's not naturally intuitive always. And I think the speaking quickly, that's the hardest part is learning how to slow down, especially when frequently we would have I'm going to use the wrong term here, but two layers of interpretation when there were languages like Quiche or other indigenous sort of dialect languages.
And for our viewers and listeners, that is known as relay interpretation.
And
And and that's actually a really, really good point. And I'm pleased to hear that you would have had those two layers, especially out in the West Coast, because there is a component of language justice, which assumes that someone who might be from a certain region, if we focus on Central or South America, that person automatically is a Spanish speaker, and that there's a certain amount of trauma that they suffer from this assumption that Spanish is the language that they speak and that it's some burden to provide an interpreter for their language or for a combination of languages which allows them to understand what's happening in the English language.
you know what? I would agree with that. And if I ever get to see them, I will thank them as well.
Well, that's the good side of some of the things that we have been exposed to. But recently, we have also seen steps that have gone in the opposite direction of, this progress that has been so hard fought and has taken so much effort to achieve. And that's that. One example is that the current administration has removed the Spanish language section of whitehouse.gov, and that signals a shift towards an English-only policy. What do you think this means rather for language access, maybe both practically and symbolically?
So I get the sense, and my sort of overarching feeling is that we're entering a moment where a lot of the leadership will really have to come from the states when it comes to moving us forward when we're thinking about language access. I also think there are so many areas where language access will continue to be critical when you sort of get down to the nitty-gritty. For example, when you have criminal matters and enforcement matters where there are witnesses or others who don't speak English, there are just core pieces of the work that is done at the Justice Department and done federally where language access is critical. I also think it's important to recognize that Title VI, the federal law, the major federal law that requires language access to be provided, is still law. And so I think figuring out what the landscape will look like going forward as we start to pivot away from a federal heavy focus on language access, what will that look like when we still do have Title VI and federal laws that require federal agencies and the federal government to ensure language access? But then also, it will be interesting to see how states begin to step up and to see whether this sort of fosters creativity, innovation, and more work, more leadership at the state level when it comes to language access.
So we haven't yet mentioned the recent executive order, which was issued on March 1st of 2025, which in fact kind of formalized what seemed to be announced when whitehouse.gov went English only. And this executive order designated English as the official national language, specifically rescinding previous federal requirements for language assistance to non-English speakers. And so this is where I think Title VI comes in, and maybe some of the other regulations and jurisprudence and precedents that that you are mentioning. Can we talk a little bit more about this and what we should know about Executive Order 13166, which was rescinded, what we should know about the impact of that and kind of where, we're standing right now?
Absolutely. And I'll give a caveat that I am not the preeminent expert on all of these regulations and executive orders, but I'm happy to sort of comment from what I do know. And so to me, the sort of core of all of this is Title VI, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance. And that has been interpreted to include providing language assistance. And so Executive Order 13166 was essentially a federal blueprint that said, here's how we're going to implement that law, and here's what's required of agencies to ensure that they are complying with Title VI. So that Executive Order 13166 required agencies to have their language access plans and required a lot of the sort of policy creation to interpret and implement Title VI. So what we saw with this executive order that rescinded EO 13166 just this month is we've sort of done away with that blueprint at this point, but the law is still there. Title VI is still there. The requirements for federal agencies to provide language access are still there. Those have not been rescinded. That is still the law. And so it'll be interesting to see what that means going forward for federal agencies. Federal agencies also have their own regulations that interpret Title VI. And so it'll be interesting to see what the future of that sort of looks like. And again, going back to kind of the point before, it'll be interesting to see how creativity and innovation and leadership may begin to emerge at the state level.
Well, two points to highlight in what you mentioned is, first of all, Title VI is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act
Right.
of 1969. And so, of course, that is one of the pillars of our, of current civil rights here in the United States, which goes, I guess, part and parcel along with the Constitution of the United States.
Right. Right. That's exactly right. Yes, it's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, I think of 1964. Yes.
Oh, I made a mistake. I thought I had made a mistake. I always like 1969 because that's the year I was born. So I made a mistake. My
Ah,
apologies to our listeners and our viewers. I'm a little bit biased, but
no, no. And I'm sure 1969 was a great year.
and in addition to that, I did want to mention that the new executive order actually mentions that although EO 13166 has been rescinded, it in no way is actually placing limits on current organizations and current departments of the US government to actually do anything differently than they may want to or have already been doing. I guess it basically takes off the restraints that if they don't want to, they don't have to. But those who have found value in addressing these issues in this targeted way are welcome to continue.
I think that's exactly right. And not only that, but coupled with the fact that it did not and cannot rescind Title VI, I think that leaves a very open playing field for federal agencies and for state and local jurisdictions to not only continue with ensuring that they're providing language access, but to also potentially even be more creative and innovative about how that can be provided, just with the sort of the framework now sort of open to the states.
And it doesn't affect the ADA, the IDEA, and any of the other acts that have preceded those.
That's exactly right.
Now, speaking about the states, and you said the creativity, I liked that because you know, we're in a time period in which this whole idea of, the federal government is big, it needs to be smaller, all of these things, and that's just a statement. It's not a political, it's not a political statement. But at the same time, if you look at that way, then you say, okay, so what are the alternatives? Well, the alternatives would have to be that the states then are more proactive in certain aspects of how they want to, govern their states and their communities. And so to that end, I think that it is very interesting that the Hawaii judiciary reaffirmed its commitment to language access. And I wanted to share this quote because I thought it speaks to what you are saying. It speaks to, the creativity, and it speaks to the commitment where those communities that thrive and rely on these types of systems and programs that promote inclusivity for, their different populations, are still going to respect and promote them. So this was a statement from the Chief Justice of the Hawaii Judiciary, Mark E. Rechtenwald. And he said that we assure court users, interpreters, and the public that the Hawaii State Judiciary remains fully committed to providing court interpreters to persons with limited English proficiency or speech or hearing impediments, which we alluded to earlier with the IDEA and the ADA. What are your reflections on, obviously you kind of predicted that, creativity and states would have to pick up the mantle, but what are your reflections on this particular statement, given that Hawaii is also one of the states, among others, that has actually more than one official language?
So I think this demonstrates just that there is a new sort of creativity and innovation that could be just really led at the local level. But I think it's also going to place there'll be a lot of questions about how our state's going to respond. And I think seeing that the state of Hawaii was very proactive and clear and signaling what they will continue to do, I think that's a really hopeful message, and I think it's very likely that other states will similarly do the same. So, one thing I'll also say, as we were drafting the language access plan and going through that process, there's one approach that says, let's do the bare minimum and comply with Title VI, right? But then so much of what we included in the language access plan, there's nothing in Title VI that mandates you to do that, right? And so now with sort of the EO 13166 kind of guardrails a little bit removed and the ability to really think outside the box, how much further can we go? How much more can we be thinking about language access policy in a creative, innovative, inclusive way to go even further beyond just the bare minimum compliance with Title VI?
What's next for Rachel Rossi?
That is a good question. I don't know. I'm taking some time to sort of level set, and we'll see what happens next. But no matter where I land, I will be in this fight for access to justice. This is my passion, and I'm excited to continue working alongside you in this.
Rachel Rossi, thank you so much for joining us here on Subject to Interpretation. I really appreciate you taking the time off and also to have a chance to chat with you about the great things that were accomplished while you were at the DOJ's Office for Access to Justice.
Thanks so much for having me, Maria. Really, it has been a delight, and I'm really grateful for the work that you're leading through this podcast.
And to our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for joining us here on Subject to Interpretation. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share. Until next time, keep advocating for language justice and access to justice for all. And most of all, don't stop learning.